Hello and welcome. We all witnessed the attack and riot on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021. And while many of us could not believe Americans would go after our own government, go after our own people, we also had to ask, how was it able to happen? Law enforcement's failure to anticipate and defend against that insurrection exposed a harsh truth. It has a white supremacy problem. The lack of preparation ahead of the Capitol attack contrasts starkly with the aggressive over policing of Black Lives Matter and environmental justice protests. So, what's behind law enforcement's blind spot when it comes to a very real threat of far right violence, both across the country and within its own ranks? And what can be done to address this and improve our response moving forward? Well, as you can tell, these are some tough questions and concerns. And thankfully, we have the right person here to talk with us about it at this Brennan Center live event. Hi again, everyone. I'm Natalie Tennant, the Kanawha County Commissioner in West Virginia, where I was also Secretary of State. And the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy organization that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice so they work for all Americans. And while we cannot support or oppose any candidate for office, we will offer you vigorous debates on the policies and positions that matter to our democracy. And of course, civility is important to all of us. Those who post rude or inappropriate language in our message stream on YouTube will be removed from the conversation. And we also ask you to follow along the conversation on social media using the hashtag Brennan Center Live, and also use the live closed captioning if you need it. Well, now, are you ready for a fascinating discussion? Let's welcome Mike German, who spent 16 years as an FBI special agent and worked undercover with white supremacist and militia groups in the 1990s. And Mike right now is a Brennan Center fellow, and he studies the government's response or lack thereof to domestic extremism. His new book is Policing White Supremacy, and it is The Enemy Within. He offers solutions for how law enforcement can do better. And his co-author is Beth Zasloff. So, Mike, thank you for joining us. There are a lot of questions that we have. In the audience, I want you to know that you can participate too by putting your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those as we move along too. Mike, this is a fascinating talk, but I want us to get started on the foundation with a little bit of history. That the establishment of the Department of Justice back in the 1870s was directly connected to addressing white supremacist violence. Won't you start us off by saying a little bit about that history?
Sure. Thanks very much, Natalie. I really appreciate that introduction. That's exactly right. After the Civil War, the Justice Department was created for the purpose of addressing white supremacist violence against newly freed slaves and African Americans, and the Congress passed what I call the first domestic terrorism laws, the Ku Klux Klan Act, and other civil rights acts, for that specific purpose, to give the federal government the authority to protect all U.S. communities, particularly from groups like the Ku Klux Klan that were gathering for the purpose of suppressing the Black vote. Those laws were very effective. And the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan was all but wiped out. Unfortunately, white supremacy is a very persistent force in the United States. And eventually the Supreme Court started chipping away at those laws and making them less effective. And when Reconstruction was ended, Jim Crow laws, overtly racist laws, were put in place to restore white supremacy as a matter of law. And that held for almost 100 years. What people tend to forget is that the U.S. law enforcement systems that were built over this time were directed to enforce white supremacy. And that was just a matter of the laws on the books were racist. So, we have to understand that history to understand why it is so persistent in policing today.
That's a good reminder, I think, to to tell people too, because, you also have talked about, when we talk about US history and policing, that it's typically white males, and they've been the ones to been, I'm not deputized, but marshaled to enforce the racist laws about slave patrols during the colonial times. I think that people maybe don't know about it or forget about that time period.
And I think for many people, it seems like ancient history, right? That was more than 100 years ago. That doesn't have anything to do today, but it's important to understand and understand that this isn't just a law enforcement problem. Obviously, my experience in law enforcement helps me focus on law enforcement, but it affects all aspects of our society. Many people were shocked, excuse me, when so many police officers were involved in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. But there were military officials involved in that as well. And there were elected representatives from various state and city legislatures who were involved as well. So this is a problem that infects all of our society, and the military and law enforcement recruit from our society. So it's a constant problem. It's not a matter of something that pops up once in a while and needs to be addressed and eradicated, and then we can all get on with our lives. We have to understand that there needs to be a consistent level of attention to this problem. And, again, it's not just in law enforcement. It's in Congress. It's in corporate boards across the United States. And I think that's why we see the Trump administration targeting public education, targeting libraries, because they know that education system is what defeats these ideas. So
Right. I'm
they
gonna
end
let
up
you get a
being the
drink real
target.
quick. Go ahead and get a drink and clear your throat, and I'm going to tell folks what we're talking about. I'm talking to Mike German, who is a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. The thing that we love to say about him, he's former FBI for 16 years, but he was undercover also. And we're talking about his newest book. He's the author of several books, but this is Policing White Supremacy, The Enemy Within, and he's written it with Beth Zasloff. And it is fascinating. It gives that history that you are talking about, and obviously you have so much credibility with it too, being a former FBI guy, and we're gonna talk about that a little bit. But let's get back to the beginning, as I mentioned, about the January 6th insurrection, because it is the most high profile, and the public got to see some of the failures that took place by law enforcement to address the violent white supremacy. So why was the FBI so unprepared or not prepared for it?
Frustratingly, for the exact same reason that the FBI didn't prepare for the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the United States. It wasn't that FBI agents around the country hadn't gathered important information that preceded the attack. In fact, they had gathered a lot of it. And unfortunately, it was the mismanagement of information that the managers at the FBI didn't chose not to devote resources to those cases because it didn't fit their priorities at the time. And with January 6th, obviously we all watched it as more and more information was coming in. Some of the groups that participated in the attack had at earlier rallies committed violence. So there was plenty of information. And we later learned that FBI agents and FBI analysts had gathered appropriate information to warn managers and had reported it up the chain. But for a long time, the FBI had not been prioritizing investigations of white supremacist violence and far-right violence, instead choosing to focus on what they called anarchists or anti-fascists, or what they labeled Black identity extremists, and even environmentalists, groups that were far less violent. It certainly had not been engaged in the kind of deadly violence that white supremacists and far-right militants have for years, going back to when I was doing these investigations in the 1990s.
Why do you think that is? Why you can't really say, it's not fair to say they took their eye off the ball, but if they weren't concentrating on the right issue is what you're saying. And why do you think that is? And
Well, I think bias drives a lot of it, and not necessarily that it's not necessarily always racial bias, but we have to keep in mind that the FBI still remains a predominantly white male organization. When J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI, he was notoriously racist and misogynistic and didn't allow women or Black agents to be part of his core group of FBI employees. And every director since then has said that diversifying the FBI is important to its ability to serve all Americans. But they haven't done what's necessary to actually address the problem. And the FBI remains almost 80% white and almost 75% male. So if you look at the political choices of white males across our society, you'll see that they tend to support conservative ideas and particularly support Donald Trump. So I think there was that bias where the Trump administration was very clear in telling the Justice Department, and Attorney General Bob Barr was also clear in directing the FBI to look for anti-fascists rather than the fascist groups that were actually posing a much more serious threat, not just to communities, but to our democracy and to law enforcement. And that was really one of the most frustrating things for me during the Trump administration, because I do have the opportunity to talk to law enforcement audiences pretty regularly, and I would try to explain to them that this affinity within law enforcement for these groups is dangerous to law enforcement. They're putting their fellow officers at risk. And unfortunately, that was borne out on January 6th very clearly.
yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking as I was reading this book, and you were talking about some of the affinity and some of the connection. And I was like, well, you're hurting yourself in a sense. And also what I think is interesting is um when you talked about the first Trump administration with Barr saying focus on anti-fascists, well, now they're almost asking, well, regular people and federal employees, and I don't know if it'll move to state employees, to regulate themselves and tell on their own coworkers if they're dabbling in DEI. And it's, I mean, I
That's
know
right.
that's a
And
bad thing, but still, it's
oh no, absolutely. It's part of the same uh, move toward authoritarianism, right? I mean, none of this is new. You can look at authoritarian governments across the world, and this is how democracies turn into autocracies, right? That you limit the education, you limit communications, and you enable a violent vigilante group to target your political enemies, so that it becomes difficult for oppositional voices to be heard. And it creates a chilling effect that if you're going to go out to protest, it might be that some violent right-wing group attacks you. And unfortunately, what we saw over the first Trump term was that police often sided with the far-right militants and it allowed them to come into communities, commit violence, and escape without any kind of interference, and often then turned law enforcement itself against the protesters. So, none of this is new. It's something we should have been prepared for. And certainly as this ramps up now, given the administration coming back in with a specified agenda of retribution, that law enforcement really needs to wake up to how to address this problem. And I hope the book helps.
well, and that's, I was gonna say, in the book, you give plenty of examples that, and obviously footnotes with it too. So if someone, doesn't take it on first face value, they can go to the end notes and look at it, and then they can look up themselves and see if indeed this is really true. Because that is um, certainly what we may be anticipating. And I know that we're getting some questions from your audience, so thank you so much. But I just want one more clarification, like as we set the groundwork here, because you refer both to white supremacists and far right militants in the book. So how do you distinguish between the two of them, and maybe give examples? Like, are the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers one or the other, or both?
Right. Thanks for that question, because it does come up, and even among academics who study the far right, there's a, a researcher named Spencer Sunshine who has a book out recently about a very narrow segment of the neo-Nazi movement. And he explained it to me that there are lumpers and splitters. It's surprising to many who aren't uh, studying this issue. A number of the white supremacist and far right militant groups, they have very different ideologies and philosophies, and oftentimes theologies that support their racial hatred and their beliefs about society. And those groups are often conflicting with one another, even though their ultimate goal is the same. So there are scholars who study the individual groups, which is very important work, even for somebody like me, to understand all the new groups that are forming. Um, but from a law enforcement standpoint, which again, policing white supremacy is designed to talk about the law enforcement aspect, that it's not necessarily uh, necessary, unless somebody's going undercover, to understand those differences. And so I'm a lumper. I lump them together rather than splitting them apart, and because their criminal activities are often together. And the groups benefit from the discussion of their different ideologies, because as abhorrent as they are to most of us, they know that there's a segment of society it will appeal to. So if we're talking about their ideology rather than, and especially fine details of their ideology, rather than talking about the violence they commit, it helps them. So I want to focus on the violence they commit. And these groups, whether they call themselves white supremacists or deny being white supremacists and are more properly labeled as far right militants, they tend to commit crime together. And particularly when they're acting in public, you saw groups who deny being racist and with groups that were openly white supremacists, carrying Confederate flags and wearing a Camp Auschwitz T-shirt. So to the extent that they're engaged in crimes together, I want to make clear that we're talking about all of them. And you mentioned the Proud Boys as one example, and that's really a perfect example, because there are people of color who are in the Proud Boys. It, but there are also white supremacists, openly white supremacist people in the Proud Boys. So it's a perfect example of that mixing for a particular purpose, and particularly when they're engaging in criminal activities.
Okay, so that's a
So,
uh,
so I try to use it as an umbrella term: white supremacist and far right militant violence. So somebody can't say, "Oh, I'm not racist, so you can't call me a white supremacist, and let's discuss what my beliefs are." You know, I'm talking about the whole as a movement, even though I acknowledge there are iterations on a spectrum, and very divergent opinions. And it's important to know too, as a society, because they're often warring with each other and
mm,
won't work together. And that's something that we should understand, so that we can take advantage of that friction. And particularly now, where that friction is alienating a lot of law enforcement.
okay. Okay, that's a good, thing to be, thinking about. Back to January 6th, what do you think the J6 pardons will have on law enforcement moving forward?
I think it's a critical moment, and we have seen some expressions of concern from organizations and associations that represent law enforcement, but it really is a clear indication. During the first Trump administration, at these rallies and events where these violent white supremacists and far-right militants would show up. They started wearing Blue Lives Matter patches or carrying Blue Lives Matter flags and fraternizing with the police officers that were there policing the protests, and gave the image that they're supporters of law enforcement. But even during that time, people associated with white supremacist groups and far-right militant groups were attacking and killing police officers. And I tried to express that to law enforcement leaders I was able to talk to, that they have to understand this problem is ultimately going to hurt law enforcement. And obviously it did on January 6th. And you had not just the crowd of white supremacists and far-right militants, but active law enforcement agents attacking other law enforcement officers. So Donald Trump coming out and giving a blanket pardon, including the people who were proven to have attacked law enforcement, I think it is an acknowledgement that he is not on law enforcement's side. And to the extent these agencies, and particularly the leaders, must recognize that anyone with an affiliation with those groups in their department is a risk to everyone in their department. And they have to be much more clear about understanding the problem and addressing the misconduct when it occurs.
Wow. I mean, and you see how to the public and the communities, how unbelievable this is and how misunderstood they could be too. I mean, that's why your book helps to really lay some things out. And that's, speaking of law enforcement, you made that statement that it's showing how you didn't say anti, but not how Trump is not for law enforcement. So are there some concerning ways that the new administration could change federal law enforcement?
Yes, and that's one of the difficulties right now is that typically on something like domestic terrorism, that's the purview of the federal government, and the FBI has been a leader in domestic terrorism, which I don't expect that it will be addressing white supremacists and far-right militant violence. But it's also important to understand that they weren't very good at it in the first Trump administration, right? When and again, you mentioned the Proud Boys, even though that's just one of a number of these groups. But when they emerged, they were very openly violent. A lot of times they were committing violence in public. They were very open in communicating their intent to commit violence, their intent to go to protests to commit violence. And once they started committing that violence, publishing videos of them doing it and crossing state lines, I assumed very quickly the FBI would nip that in the bud. Usually at the time when I was undercover in the 1990s, these groups tried to keep quiet about what they were doing, right? They knew that they were the subject of law enforcement attention, so they did what they could to hide what they were doing and operate in the shadows. But coming out in public, gave the FBI opportunities that unfortunately it didn't take advantage of, where now state and local law enforcement must know that and not rely on the FBI to gather the intelligence and to provide them with information of these groups, that it's up to them to do it. And they, in order to protect their communities and the members of their departments, they need to get more attuned and communicate better with other law enforcement, other state and local law enforcement, so that they can address this problem without that kind of federal assistance.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like these groups are more emboldened. I mean, if they weren't stopped before, why would they be stopped now?
Uh, so it's also important to understand that they are not Republicans. They aren't supporting a Republican agenda. They aren't necessarily even supporting a Trump agenda, all of them, right? And that's really one of the problems with giving a green light to political violence the way Trump has done with the pardons, that you can't predict who that violence is going to target. And many of these white supremacist ideologies and far-right militant ideologies are very obscure, but once you start going down that rabbit hole, it becomes your entire world, and how you interpret events, it is very different and shocking to many people. But it didn't surprise me at all that the young man who took a shot at the president, tried to assassinate him, according to the FBI's what they released about the investigation, which is very little, that he was, communicating in these chat rooms, expressing the same kind of anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant rhetoric that the administration promotes. So the idea that they wouldn't target people in the Republican or Trump administration isn't accurate, particularly, just as on January 6th, when these groups that had been wearing Blue Lives Matter patches were all of a sudden attacking police officers, right? I'm sure part of the lack of preparation was because the police they thought these were supporters, not people who would violently attack police. So, it's a very dangerous thing to give a green light to political violence, because it's going to be very difficult to predict who it will hurt.
Yeah, that's a good thought. So what role, though, then communities themselves play in identifying and addressing white supremacy within law enforcement? Is there anything that we can do?
Certainly, and certainly, it's important to hold your local and state officials accountable and make sure that you're talking to your elected representatives, that you're talking to your law enforcement leaders. But we also have learned that we can't rely on law enforcement to protect us from this. And a lot of the information during the first administration that ultimately led to charges in some cases came from investigative journalists, came from anti-fascist activists who had gathered information about these groups, came from academics who were gathering information about these groups and reporting it. So there's plenty of information there. But I think it's important for communities to recognize that we don't have to rely on law enforcement in the criminal justice system to protect communities. Part of the purpose of this kind of far-right political violence, and particularly white supremacist violence, is to divide communities against each other and to disrupt that social cohesion. So we need to build that social cohesion, not just when somebody is attacked, certainly when somebody is attacked, but even before that, because there are alternative methods that are being developed across the country, restorative justice programs that are being started. So it's important to look for those in your community, or develop them from successful examples that are happening elsewhere, and realize that there is an alternative to the punitive system of criminal justice that actually is designed to heal communities and to help rebuild that social cohesion when somebody is victimized. And especially having worked in the criminal justice system, it's not designed in the United States to really help the victims, and it's often very destructive, not just to the subject of that investigation, but to entire communities. So we really have to rethink the way that we approach our responses to violent crimes, and protect one another better, and support survivors of violence much more creatively.
Yeah. You use a lot of data, and data is relied upon if it's correct and there. Do you know how many law enforcement officers are far right militia or white supremacist sympathizers?
We don't have a total number because no government agency seeks this information out. There are great researchers. I'd recommend people looking at the work of Vida B. Johnson at Georgetown University, who has a spreadsheet where she documents these cases. But it's usually investigative journalists and advocacy organizations that expose this. And often when a police officer's affiliation or misconduct with one of these groups is exposed, what we find is the police department knew about that long before. the public found out, but only took action once the public found out. And so it's very important that government, and not just law enforcement, right? Our elected representatives have a role here, compel agencies to investigate this issue, because it was frustrating as an FBI agent, because I received these warnings internally that, hey, Mike, you're going undercover in these groups, and we know law enforcement often has links to these groups. So you have to be very careful about who you share information with about these investigations within law enforcement. And I worked on a joint terrorism task force that had agents and officers from a number of different federal, state, and local agencies. And none of them thought that was an odd warning. And that warning has since been put on paper. There were internal documents going back to 2006. The FBI's counterterrorism policy guide in 2015 warns agents investigating domestic terrorism investigations against white supremacists and far-right militants that their subjects, the people they're investigating for domestic terrorism, will often have active links to law enforcement. And it tells them to change their tactics to make sure they're not giving law enforcement information about the case and who they're investigating. But it doesn't have anything about how they should be protecting the community from these law enforcement officers who have active links to white supremacists and far-right militants. And that's really the problem, that we have to recognize these people are a public safety threat, and we have to start treating them that way.
Well, that brings up kind of some questions, and maybe we'll get to if law enforcement officers are disciplined for being involved. But you brought up a point that I've just been dying to ask about being an undercover officer. Like when you got that message, I guess maybe the first question is, why would you do it? What kind of person does it take to be an undercover FBI agent?
So I got to work with some really incredibly talented FBI agents, and I would put the case agents on my cases, even though they weren't doing the undercover work. They were the ones really who built the cases and who, overcame the obstacles that FBI management had put in place to try to frustrate our efforts. So there are a lot of good people in the FBI. That's why I continue doing this work. Even though I'm highly critical of the FBI's policy and management, I know that there are a lot of good people there trying to do good work. And I had wanted to be an FBI agent from the time I was a little kid. So the opportunity to do what I thought was important work I jumped at it. And I had worked 4 years on savings and loans fraud, which also was fascinating and very important work. But I was looking for a different challenge, and this was certainly a very different challenge. And then through that first case, discovered that I was good at it and had some talent. So I continued working in undercover cases of a variety of criminal operations for the next 12 years. But I grew up in a military family, so serving the community was kind of in my blood, and I think that the work I do at the Brennan Center is just continuing that service.
Yeah. When someone goes undercover, do they almost like yes, you're disguised, and do you almost become a different person? Like what has to be your mindset that you're the undercover person, yet you're working with the caseworker, or and then at the same time you're told don't share too much with law enforcement because they might be the bad guy too. Like what mindset do you have to work on?
So like I said, I got to work with some really incredible people who did undercover work on a regular basis, and uh, nobody had one model that they used. There were some people who just naturally were the life of the party, and were very outgoing and boisterous, and used that personality to attract friends in the wrong places. I'm much more reserved than that. And I didn't try to change my personality at all. I mean, I think the reason people like me in real life is because I try to be on time and do what I say I'm going to do, and be honest about what I'm doing. And it's really just the last one that I wasn't true with them. But part of the reason why I was successful in those cases was something as simple as showing up on time, and the criminal element doesn't usually consider promptness one of the most important things, as any law enforcement officer who's done surveillance will tell you. And the agents and officers that I worked with would often say, why are we rushing? They're going to be half an hour late, so why do we have to be there on time? But I just felt that it was important to give them the impression that I was reliable, because when they needed somebody to do something risky for them, which is, criminal activity they saw as risky, I wanted them to reach out to me rather than somebody else, and perhaps, hurt somebody in a way where I didn't have advanced knowledge of it. So I really kept my personality pretty much the same. And it was just a matter of understanding my role as a law enforcement officer was to gather information about criminal activities. And so documenting those conversations in a way that made clear what was happening was how I was able to be successful in those cases.
That's interesting to know. You go on your established personality in your own life. What did you look like?
Uh, Really no different than I look now. And I was much younger. I was in my late 20s, early 30s. But particularly the first case was targeting groups of skinheads, and there was discussion of whether I would have to shave my head. But I wasn't really trying to I wasn't pretending that I was part of the movement. Um, the legend that we had created for me was more that I was a successful criminal, and they were recruiting me into the white supremacist group, hoping to exploit my criminal talents. So I was able to present myself as somebody who was willing to learn, which was a great way to approach it, because they ended up being very, very good teachers of how to commit terrorism, and it made the conversations, which is what I was trying to gather as evidence, much more detailed, because they had to explain to me what they were doing.
It's you said it's been 20 years since you've done that type of work. Would we as the public recognize some of, I don't know, your successes, your your I don't know what you call it, like an investigation? Having an investigation is sometimes a successful part, right? Because you never know what you're going to get out of it.
Right. And, if you're a good undercover agent, sometimes your assumptions going in, you find out aren't true. And, that, I think the counterterrorism undercover operations changed significantly after 9/11, particularly when targeting Muslim Americans, but also Trevor Aronson, a journalist, has done really great reporting about these cases where, rather than targeting somebody who's tied to a terrorist group or involved in a terrorist operation, the FBI had been targeting people who were vulnerable, whether because they had mental health or social issues, or simply because they were poor, and basically introduce a government agent who pretends to be part of a terrorist organization that recruits the people to commit some act, and then once they're induced to commit the act, putting the handcuffs on them and saying, "Oh, we caught another terrorist." But in my mind, you're not catching a terrorist. And unfortunately, that modality got popular in the FBI, and it does target white supremacists as well, usually not as aggressively, but it's just not an effective way of targeting people who are actually doing harm. where on the other side of the ledger, the FBI doesn't even collect data about the number of domestic terrorism incidents that occur or how many people are killed in them. So they don't know how many Americans white supremacists kill each year, as an example. And Congress tried to get at that information back in 2020. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2020 required the FBI to report data on domestic terrorism incidents and the fatalities that result. But the FBI, shockingly, in public reports, acknowledges that they don't collect that information. Again, this is supposed to be their number one priority, and yet they
Yeah.
don't even bother to know what terrorists or incidents, and particularly ones that are fatal.
Yeah. You have some of that information in the book too. One other thing that you have in the book that it 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 piqued my interest was that you talked about um, being brought back in or out, however you make it, during the Timothy McVeigh in 1995 in the Oklahoma City bombing. And I remember I was a reporter then in West Virginia. And so, you're always looking for stories. Well, we found that there was this connection to West Virginia because William Pierce had written a book, Turner Diaries, that Timothy McVeigh um, had read, and I guess even had it on the truck or something, some pages like that. I
Mhm.
mean, what did you ever make it to West Virginia? And, what was that time period like?
It was very frustrating because it is, you know, I think part of it was the government's not accurately explaining what was going on, and part of it is the media. The media, again, we have to understand these structures exist throughout our society, and they tend to become, chase the sensationalized story rather than focusing on what's really going on. And you're right, the Turner Diaries was a white supremacist novel written by William Pierce, the leader of a white supremacist organization, above ground white supremacist organization at the time, that laid out a plan for how to start the race war in
Mhm.
novel form and
Yeah,
fiction form. But it started with a truck bomb targeting a federal building. So it's
right.
very clear that McVeigh was following that, and in fact, apparently had that page of the novel with him in his vehicle when he was arrested.
Yeah.
So, understanding how these groups operate, and one term that has come up a lot when you talk about white supremacist violence is this concept of lone wolves. That,
Mm,
and law enforcement is often very quick to identify white supremacist attackers as lone wolves. These people are by themselves, acting alone, nothing more to see here. Uh, but the failure to collect all those incidents and data, and the concept that, all these different white supremacist activities are all separate from one another, I think blinds law enforcement to what is a more networked movement, and not necessarily that other people were involved in that specific conspiracy, but it's important to understand how these groups operate so that they can be policed more effectively.
yeah, and that's interesting you say that because that was April 19th, 1995, and there are other, events in our country that violent events that happened on April 19th, on April's 19th, I
Right,
guess.
right. Yeah, yeah, it's a
We could
very
get into that,
important
yeah.
date,
Yeah.
and, to them. That it was Patriots Day, the shot heard around the world. So they envision themselves as patriots for their cause, even though they're actually fighting against American democracy. Um,
Yeah. Am I thinking
and
that right? David Koresh, Waco, and then Columbine, they all April 19th.
uh,
Am I thinking correctly?
um, I don't have it in front of me. I think Columbine might have
Just
been
thinking in my
April
head too.
20th,
Yeah.
which is also a very important date because that's Hitler's birthday. So there's a lot of this, and remember, Waco was when the FBI assaulted the
Mhm.
compound. So that wasn't really the white supremacists. And, kind of another perfect example
Right.
where the David Koresh and the Branch Davidians were not white supremacists. It was a multiracial religious group, but for some reason, white supremacists
Mm,
embraced them, and certainly far-right militants embraced them, which
yeah.
again reinforces this idea that, people are surprised. And we did a series uh, at the Brennan Center with Paula Ramos, who wrote about Latino members of these white supremacist and far-right movements, which people tend to be surprised by, but it's very common.
Yeah. Let's some more questions. Thank you for answering my, my West
Sure.
Virginia connection questions. We always seem to have them. Some of the audience, and thank you audience for providing questions and for participating here. One is how have free speech claims complicated police response to white supremacy?
That's a great question. And it's fascinating how law enforcement too often doesn't honor the free speech right of environmentalist groups who are protesting, or Black Lives Matter, or other groups. But somehow when it comes to white supremacists, they keep focusing, oh, they have a First Amendment right, which of course we all do, and they do too. But what I talk about is the violence. You don't have a First Amendment right to shoot somebody. You don't have a First Amendment right to assault somebody. So this idea that the First Amendment is somehow an impediment to effectively enforcing those laws is an excuse not to take action. And again, to the extent that I'm pleased, to the extent that law enforcement recognizes there's a First Amendment, but I wish they would apply that principle more broadly to groups that they tend to ignore their First Amendment rights. But it's really not an issue. But again, it shows why collecting that domestic terrorism incident data is so important. That if you're not identifying the criminal acts, you're not going to be able to identify criminal acts before they occur, right? A lot of times what we see at these rallies is groups often coming in from out of state to commit violence. And that's a methodology these groups have used going back to the original Nazi Party in Germany, where they'll host a rally or attend a demonstration in a community where they know they have political opposition, for the purpose of drawing out their opposition so they can attack them. And the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was a perfect example, where law enforcement was treating it as a First Amendment activity, where what clearly came out of the civil suit that utilized the secret chats that the organizers were having, they were preparing to engage in violence, and many of them also had serious criminal records. But the after action reviews of that incident by law enforcement found that they weren't checking criminal histories, and they were monitoring public social media, but they weren't looking at the criminal histories. And in explaining themselves, they said, well, we thought they had a First Amendment right, where they do. They have a First Amendment right to engage in public speech without interference from law enforcement, but they don't have a right to commit crimes. And that criminal history is very important to understanding crimes.
Yeah.
And so it's a problem, but it's not the problem that law enforcement pretends it is.
Yeah, you detailed a lot of that in the book in explaining that. A question from an audience: what are the biggest barriers to implementing a more effective national strategy against far right militant violence?
Another great question. There is no barrier. There's just a lack of will to create a national strategy. And what we often see, even with the Biden administration, that when they create a national strategy, they don't direct it at white supremacists and far right militant violence, which is by far the most deadly of the categories that the FBI creates around its domestic terrorism program. They do it broadly, a broad domestic terrorism statute, without recognizing that this particular brand is very different because it's part of our mainstream society, and that there are people in government, people in law enforcement, people in the military who are part of this. And it's not just some extreme group on the margin of society that doesn't have impact on the rest of us. No, this is part of something that is much larger and needs to be addressed differently than some marginal group out there that's not really engaged in the same kind of serious violence that white supremacists are. So it just requires the political will to create a strategy and focus on this serious problem, rather than bringing in animal rights activists and environmentalists that really haven't killed anybody in the United States and don't regularly engage in violence that could be deadly.
Yeah. We're getting some questions. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but a lot of questions about, because people want action items. Actually, that's why they need to read the book. There, page 6 is dedicated to a strategy for change. And this is Policing White Supremacy: The Enemy Within. We're talking with Mike German, who is a former FBI agent, now Brennan Center fellow, who has written this book. But what can individuals and community groups do to combat far-right militancy in law enforcement and society? Maybe hit that a little bit again.
Sure. So first, we're still in a democracy and a representative democracy that we work through our elected representatives. So make sure you know what the positions are of the people, not just in the federal government, more importantly now, in your local government, in the city, in the county, and in the state, and make sure that your opinion is known to them and documented, and also with law enforcement. When I talk about this problem, the problem of white supremacist affiliations with law enforcement, many police leaders will say, well, hey, we don't have the ability to get into the minds of our officers, and we can't monitor their social media 24/7. So how are we supposed to identify these people? And I tell them it's easy. Look at the complaints. The communities know who the racist officers are, and the police officers know who the racist officers are. But right now, it's more dangerous to a law enforcement career for somebody to report a colleague's racist misconduct than it is to engage in racist misconduct.
And to be racist. Wow.
And that's what needs to change.
Wow.
So make sure you're documenting this, but more importantly, reach out in your community. There are anti-racist groups in your community. And, even beyond this, there are groups feeding the hungry, housing the homeless. These are the community organizations that we need to support, particularly in a time when resources are going to become from the federal government are going to be shut off. So make sure that you're reaching out in your community to make sure that everybody feels safer and knows that they have an ally.
Yeah. A good question here I heard you say it and we kind of passed by it, but someone would like to know what you meant by saying restorative justice can help combat white supremacy.
Thanks for that question. Another really good one. So restorative justice are alternative systems to the criminal justice system. And they take many forms, which would be too hard to get into all of them. There are scholars like Danielle Sered, S-E-R-E-D, I believe. You should read her work. I worked with Shirin Sinar at Stanford Law School and putting together a report about how these restorative justice programs, I think, are well positioned to address hate crimes and racist violence, mostly because police already aren't focused on it. They aren't really very reactive to these types of crimes. So there's already a vacuum that can be filled. But, again, with the idea that this violence is meant to divide communities and isolate them, community work that's designed to improve social cohesion, to address what the victim really wants, which often is just an acknowledgement from the offender. And they have, like I said, a lot of different ways of accomplishing that. But it's a very important aspect because so many resources now, city and local resources are being given to the police departments. And in this particular
Mhm.
area, the police aren't necessarily the best option for addressing these concerns.
Well, I guess that brings up another question of how how open would federal, state, and local agencies be to these meaningful reforms and
Um,
to improve the law enforcement response with this?
that's a good question. I wrote a report for the Brennan Center back in 2020, um, that focused on white supremacy and law enforcement. And I was expecting to get a lot of grief from my former colleagues in law enforcement, uh, and was somewhat surprised that most of the attention I got was positive, even from law enforcement. And um, really, the harshest criticism I got was during a hearing in the House Oversight Committee, where a law enforcement witness said, "Well, we acknowledge this is an issue and a problem, but we don't think it's as big a problem as Mike is suggesting." To which I responded, how many? What is the right number of white supremacists in law enforcement that we don't have to
Yeah,
worry about, right?
yeah,
That really this is a problem, that even though you could point and say, well, you only have dozens of cases in a very large community of law enforcement. Those are the cases we know about, and certainly what we see are racial disparities in every aspect of policing, from who they stop to who they search to who they arrest to how long those people are sentenced and how they're charged. So those disparities don't come from nowhere, and we've known about them for decades and not addressed it. So we can no longer say that that's part of unconscious bias. We're
yeah.
conscious of it. We know that it happens. We've known for a long time. We have to actually take the steps necessary to correct the problem.
A few minutes left, and I think people would be interested. You talked about what kind of response, because this is not your first book. You've had several books, and obviously a lot of information written on the Brennan Center website. The response that you get from your former colleagues, but what you said too, like you have to give. What is the process that you go through in writing these books when it comes to getting the approval from the FBI?
So the books have employment contract I signed with the FBI requires them to review the book before I publish it, to make sure I'm not putting any classified information on it, which I did very little classified work at the FBI anyway. Um, but the regulation says they should do this review in 30 days. But in this case, after I submitted it, they sent me a note saying we won't be able to look at this for 11 months. And
Dang. And so
luckily,
much and it
my
finally comes out, yeah,
right,
January 7th.
luckily my congressman reached out to them and sped it up to 7 months. But it's still a problem, and it's part of an effort to suppress uh, uh,
Wow.
the free speech. There the First Amendment really applies, right? That
Right,
their mismanagement of resources shouldn't be used to suppress criticism of the FBI.
yeah. Alright, one last question then. This is always, to walk away with and maybe even an action item, but what is the one thing that you would like the audience to walk away with this afternoon?
Um, that it's important to take the matters into your own hands. That this isn't something that somebody out there is going to take care of. It's part of our society. Understanding and recognizing it, and making sure that you're doing what's necessary to build that social cohesion with your community, particularly communities that are marginalized, and particularly communities that are targeted by government policy, and recognizing that each effort you make in that regard is pushing back against this systemic problem that we have to understand better in order to address.
Very good. I appreciate that, and I think the audience appreciates that too, and yeah, certainly our country. So, thank you, Mike German. The book is "Policing White Supremacy: The Enemy Within." He wrote it with Beth Zasloff. Thank you for being here and sharing it with us. Thank you, audience, for all your questions. And the Brennan Center looks forward to seeing you at many of our other events. And if you'd like to have some information and be the first to know about it, you can sign on to our newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. Thank you for joining us. I'm Natalie Tennant, West Virginia and Kanawha County Commissioner, and I'll see you next time. See ya.